The Lord be with you. And let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, we give you thanks for this new day, for the sun that shines, for the rains that have come now and again, and for your word that showers upon us the good news of your work for our salvation. Give us now the gift of your Holy Spirit, for it is through the Spirit that we gain faith, it is through the Spirit that we gain understanding. So we pray for the Spirit's gifts this day in Christ's name. Amen. Well, today we're going to probably leave the region of the Galilee after today and start down the Jordan Valley with one or two exceptions or so as we bump into places on the way. And today we're at the very top of the Galilee. Bethsaida is just about 1230 on the circle of the Galilee. Got that in mind, just on the other side, the east side of the Jordan, where we've been on now for a week. But we'll then go up, in fact, before we go to Bethsaida, we'll go all the way up to the border of Lebanon, which is still part of the Galilee region, to a place called Dan, a historic city founded 4500 BCE. So if we call this ancient, that's exactly the right adjective to use. 4500 BC, the city of Dan, and which was before that Laish, Laish. So we'll go there first. And the reason for that is to try to get into historical perspective this whole issue of the history of the northern and southern kingdoms, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. It was first a united kingdom, and during the time of David and Solomon, it is said that the people lived in peace from Dan to Beersheba. And so just to get a sense of what we're talking about there, Dan and Beersheba, and then to go to Dan because there's a very, very important reason to go to Dan, and I'll betray that as we go along. Let me talk about the pictures a little bit first. You've heard me talking again and again about how a city was built on top of a city, on top of a city, on top of a city, until you built kind of a strange mountain. The picture on the front page is the mound of the ancient city of Beersheba from the north, looking from Jerusalem down. Beersheba is in the Negev desert. It's the largest city in the Negev desert. It has approximately, as I say here somewhere, 187,000 people, though perhaps less now, because with the newer Gaza rockets with guidance systems on their nose cones, Beersheba can be reached by the mid-range Palestinian rockets. So it has had an effect on the 186 or 87,000 people who live in that city. They don't all live on this mountain. This is the ancient city of Beersheba, but you can see how the mound is built by constant rebuilding of cities. It's not a mountain, it is a mound. You'll also see how there are no trees on the mound. That's intentional, because in the time of war, you want the enemy to have to come uphill, and you don't want the enemy to have trees to hide under, or even against which to anchor the base of a ladder. So you don't ever grow anything on what's called, the French word, the glacis. At the top of the mound, there would have been, in the ancient city, a wall around the top of the mound. So the news isn't bad because of the mound itself. It's bad also that when you get to the top of it, you got to go up a ladder and go over the wall. With soldiers on the top of the wall, shooting down, throwing stuff down, or how about pouring hot oil down, a favorite tactic. Going up that ladder was a real challenge. I still do not understand this to this day, how, by the way, the forces of the World War II armies that attacked the Normandy beach ever got up that cliff. A lot of them didn't. But that they got up at all, when in fact they were totally exposed going up. It's kind of like Chinese hordes coming and you can't shoot them all. Some will get through. At any rate, I want you to see that picture because it's such a good picture. And this is Beersheba. This is in the south. It's almost directly across, it's below the Dead Sea. If we drew a straight line across the area, it would be below the Dead Sea. It's somewhat well into the desert area called the Negev, N-E-G-E-V. And I thought that would be worth seeing. Secondly, on page 2, the Bronze Age mud brick gate. It's called sometimes Abraham's Gate because it was built about the time Abraham went up to settle a feud with his family, and he would have gone through this gate. The arch above it is not a halo of holiness, it's simply a canopy to protect the deterioration of the mud brick any further now that it's been dug out and exposed. Mud brick is tough. In fact, most of Beersheba that you see here was built with mud brick, but it's in a desert and it's dry and that stuff is tough, and of course the hot sun makes it tougher. It's the same mud brick here which leads archaeologists to say somebody built it that didn't know about the region of Dan, which is relatively humid and at times very wet. In fact, there's so much water around Dan, and I didn't have time or space to put all the pictures, that for a while there was a water moat around most of Dan, just calling on the water that comes down from Mount Hermon. So at any rate, the mud brick gate has a canopy over it that draws your attention more than the gate, but the gate is somewhere around 1200 BCE. The time of Abraham's journey down to the Promised Land. The next picture we'll talk, and the next one we'll talk about in a moment. Here at Dan is the Iron Age gate chambers. There are times that I wish for a chalkboard, and I never think in advance to ask for it. But notice that, look toward the left center of this picture to top of page 3, and you will see 2 chambers that go back on each side. There's a third one that doesn't get in the picture. Then you'll see facing chambers on the other side, and you'll see a paved road in the middle. This is an Iron Age gate. You will see similar kinds of gates at Gezer, at Megiddo, at Hatzor, and at Dan. It almost looks as if the same architect designed all of them. This gate would have been probably 3 stories high, so there would have been 2 additional stories above this, and now have been destroyed. On the left side, though this picture doesn't show it, there are benches on 3 sides of these enclaves because the gate was the great gathering place to get the news. They still didn't mail the Washington Post or the New York Times, and as a result, the way you found out what was happening anyplace else was to sit at the gate and talk to the travelers who came in through that gate and say, "What's going on? Where did you come from?" And they'd tell you, and they say, "What's going on there?" And that was like getting the morning newspaper. But that's not the total reason they were built. Another time, one of these might have been restricted off for the over 65 crowd. And the over 65 crowd would have had benches on 3 sides, the back side and the 2 sides of one of these chambers. And it would be set aside as the town's notary public place because seniors were used as the minor judiciary to settle minor fights. For example, if you came to one of the senior judiciary and you said, my neighbor has stolen some property from me and I want it back, and they would listen to your story. And of course, the neighbor could go too and tell his side of the story, but you usually didn't invite him. And you would get a git, G-I-T, and the git was a judgment against the neighbor that said you must return this property to Abraham or whoever it was. And so you go to your neighbor and say, I've got the git on you, and you have to do thus and so because, and that kind of thing. So it was a place not only for gathering to hear the news, but it was a place also as the minor judiciary center of an ancient Iron Age city. So this is an important thing, but the thing is really built for war. And so you would have a big, if you imagine this road, if we come down here to the next picture and make a sharp right 90-degree turn, and then come down another long road, that would have been the way this gate was built, so that no chariot could rush the city. You would come down here, first you'd have to break through that gate, and then you'd have to make a right turn, and only some sports cars could do that today. You'd make the right turn and you'd run the gauntlet. You know the phrase, running the gauntlet? Well, this is part of what that was. There would be archers and soldiers at 3 levels shooting down into this roadway. And so when the chariots tried to rush, they would shoot the horses, they would shoot the charioteer, and what would happen in this roadway? Clog up, exactly. So you're not going to bring 1,000 chariots and rush the city. It won't work. And it was a very effective Iron Age gate. You could batter down most any kind of single swinging open gate. But once you'd done that, you had to go through here to get into the city. This is one of the best pictures because while the Iron Age gates are evident when you're there, it's hard to photograph them and see the chambers because they aren't all that way. Megiddo has them. Gezer has better examples, and Hatzor has fine examples. They used to be thought to all be Solomon's cities. And some now say they were built by Solomon and some by Ahab in the northern kingdom. But at any rate, I just wanted to hold the Iron Age gate in front of you to say it's different from the little doorway that Abraham would have walked through in the 11th or 10th centuries. Then the home of the fishermen of Bethsaida. You can't tell much from this rubble, but in the rubble they found all kind of paraphernalia related to the industry of fishing in this house. So this obviously was a fisherman's house. And there's some archaeologists that believe some of the foundations they found in the Galilee, which the water now covers, were part of a pier at Bethsaida and included a boathouse that they call Zebedee's boathouse, that he built boats and tended to boats there. And maybe so, maybe not. We don't still have a nice white painted sign in front of it telling us what it was, but they say that Zebedee built and repaired boats there. Whether it was Zebedee's or somebody else's, I don't know, but I'm getting ahead of my story. But just to talk to you about the pictures, then let me come down, just turn the page one more time. And here you'll see the plain and the sea of Bethsaida. Bethsaida as a town is up this hill, now 1.2 miles away from the shoreline, which is a strange way for a fishing village to be located. But here is the huge grassy plain that we'll talk about a little later. So those are the pictures, and that explains what they deal with. Ancient's the right word to use when we talk about Dan, because of course it was called Lisha, but the archaeological evidence suggests that Dan was founded around 4500 BC. That's about 3,500 years before the Israelites arrived. Okay? So then it was a Phoenician city, because the language was clearly Old Phoenician, written in cuneiform script and then later in a kind of Hebraic script. Laish was its name. It was probably settled by people from Sidon, Tyre and Sidon, or Phoenician cities. And it was probably settled by the Phoenicians. It had ties with Sidon. And, you know, there's two words that we use all the time in the Old Testament. One is Philistines, and the other is Phoenicians. It sounds a little alike, and we get them confused. Why do we confuse them? They both clung to the shoreline of the Mediterranean. They were both originally, quote, to use the Egyptian term for them at that time, sea peoples. They invaded Egypt, and Egypt pushed them out. They got back in their boats, and this is the case of the Philistines. They got back in their boats and went north to what we call now the Gaza Strip and resettled again. And they resettled 4 places: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron. They're the 4 Philistine cities, large civilizations. They appear in the Holy Land not long before the Israelites arrived. Now, when I say not long before the Israelites arrived, 1150 about. And it was 1150 that they were pushed out of Egypt. The Egyptians pushed them back into the sea, and so they moved up and around and settled along the shoreline at the place we call Gaza first, and then on up the coast to Ashkelon and Ashdod and Ekron. So they had 4 major cities. They are the Philistines. They were originally sea peoples. It's thought from Crete, but nobody is altogether sure where they came from. They're simply called Aegean and Aegean sea people. So it's a semi-Greek culture, but it's the Philistines who gave the early tribes occupation in the Promised Land so very much difficulty. If you remember, Goliath, the giant, is a Philistine. David, the Boy Scout, 12 years old kind of guy, kills Goliath because Goliath terrified. They always won their battles, except neither succeeded in conquering the other until David became king. And David finished off the problem with the Philistines. He never dislodged them, but they no longer gave any significant trouble to the Israelites in their settlement of the Promised Land after David. One wonders why the Philistines, established and obviously fierce fighters, they killed Saul, David's predecessor, nailed him to the wall at Beit Shean, and we'll talk about that next week, and his son were nailed to the wall at Beit Shean. Why were they unable to dislodge the Israelites? They're not Israelis, they're Israelites. And why were the Israelites, once David became powerful, why did the Israelites find themselves unable to dislodge the Philistines? They actually began to live somewhat peacefully. There was no need to dislodge them, but there were probably 2 other reasons as well. The Israelites' lands are in the hill country. The Philistines were chariot people. Chariots don't do good in hilly country. They're not the roaring kind of war machine that they are along a flat piece of land like the shore of the Mediterranean. Are you with me so far? Bigger reason than that, the Iron Age arrived for the Philistines about 100 years before it arrived for the Israelites. And the end result was that bronze doesn't stand up, as I said last Sunday, doesn't stand up very well against iron. And so when you engaged in fights and your chariots were built and your weapons are built largely of bronze, and you're fighting against iron swords, and iron chariots, you're going to lose that battle. And so there was this difficult time with the Philistines. In fact, the Philistines actually captured the Ark of the Covenant, and they carried it first to one city and then to another, and every place it went, it seemed to curse the city, and finally they brought it back and said, here, we don't want it anymore, and brought it back. But they were able to win battles against the Israelites, and so that was a tense time. And they never were able, and finally no longer desirous, to expel either one of them. The Philistines did something else that was useful to the people of Israel. They were sea people. They understood sea travel. And as a result, they became somewhat commercial suppliers for the needs of Israel, or the Israelites. So, after a while, it gets to be a comfortable agreement. You bring our stuff, we'll buy it from you, and we don't have to go to sea. The people of Israel have never been seafaring people. When Jonah gets the call by God to go to Nineveh and be an evangelist for Nineveh, Jonah, A, doesn't want to go. And B, doesn't think Ninevites are people of God anyway. They're not Jews. So he has two reasons for not going. He doesn't want them to have the good news. And two, he doesn't want to go. So he decides, what does Jonah decide to do? Get away from God. How is he going to do this? Gets in a boat and goes to sea. And even God won't go to sea, Jonah thinks. And this mindset is kind of deeply rooted in the ancient tradition of the Hebrews. So, as a result, he goes to sea to escape God. Of course, the storm comes, and the mariners are panicked, and he says, it's not you guys, it's me. Throw me overboard, and the storm will stop. They did, it did, and through the story continues to go. And Jonah get burped up by the whale after a period of time with his clothes half digested, decided it was better to go to Nineveh than to go to sea. Anyhow, that's the Philistines. North of them, beginning at Akko today and going north, you had Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Anwad. You have the Phoenician cities. Now, the Phoenicians never really gave up being sea people. They traveled the Mediterranean, and they became really the commercial clan. And Solomon makes a deal with them. He gets the cedars of Lebanon from them. They'll sell anything they got, apparently. But they also provide the real fleet. The Philistines had kind of gotten used to being on land, but the Phoenicians never quite did. And until about 300 BCE, they were the merchants of the Mediterranean world. They developed, are you ready for this? Our mathematic numeral system comes from the Phoenicians. The idea of coined money comes from the Phoenicians. If you're merchants, you want to find an easy way to exchange money or exchange things of value. Trading it for like items is difficult trading. Let's find a way to exchange value. They come up with coined money. So they played a major role. Dan, Laish at the time, was a Phoenician city. Not always, because it starts 4500 BC, and even the Phoenicians weren't there yet. But Dan, by the time the Israelites arrive in the Promised Land, was Laish, Laish, you see on page 2. And it was a Phoenician city. Tyre and Sidon, a Phoenician Sidon, and the residents of Laish were from Sidon. They were Phoenicians. So this was a Phoenician inland city on the border of what is now Lebanon. Any questions? Yes?
Well, we know that the Bible comes down pretty hard on the Philistines. They were generally regarded as but was there any reference to the Phoenicians? I don't recall anything in the scripture.
To the Phoenicians? Well, we don't call them that in the Bible, but Solomon rather, bought the cedars of Lebanon from them for the temple. So, yes, we have dialogue with them, and they were not a warlike people. Phoenicians were more warlike. Philistines were more warlike. Phoenicians were not. They, you buy something from me, you're my friend. Yes?
Do modern-day Palestinians trace their lineage back to Philistines?
They would like to say we've been here forever.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but they also like to say there never was an Israel here. And the UN made them stop saying that, which is one of the interesting things the UN did. But they would like to say this had been in my family for thousands of years. Probably not true. But that they have been there for a while is true. And they are the results of not simply Canaanite culture. This particular bit of property from about 600 CE was ruled by the Turks. And the Ottoman Empire also did its transplanting of people, so that the parentage of anybody there today is hard to extend very far. Then, of course, the Brits came, and the British Mandate after World War the Turks chose the wrong side in World War I, so the land was taken from them and given to the British as a British Mandate. And, of course, there are a lot of Brits there. The Episcopalian Diocese of Jerusalem has a beautiful cathedral church, and a lot of people go to church there who are not Palestinians, because there's a good footprint of the Brits in Palestine as well. So, it's the issue about propaganda is both sides are lying, and it's the same on the other side as well. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? That the Jews were there, that the Jews governed this strip of land for about 1,000 years, except for the exile and so forth, is pretty much not controvertible, historically speaking. So they have a time there. Now, if we go back to the beginning, when they go in and mop up the land and call it the Promised Land, if you don't believe the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God and take for granted that God had the right to give them this land, their major claim for it impresses nobody in the Western world. Ancient history, why are they so great in archaeology? Everything they dig up that's got their name on it proves they were there.
Oh, right, yes.
Sure. So that, who's been there the longest? Well, they're in the top crowd. So, but the argument they use, because it's their faith, is that it was land given to them by God. That's a horse of a different color archaeologically. Does that probably goes much further, more information than you wanted.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
It's food
Other comments?
It's food for thought. It's food for thought.
Yeah. It's no doubt they were there. And now let me just jump on to the issue of why Dan is important to us now. Jesus never went there. Jesus was never in Dan. So why do I bother us with it today? Well, Dan had been abandoned in 733, which just happens to be the same time that Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrian king who came down and wiped out the 10 northern tribes, went through Dan at 733, 732, and he destroyed the cities and depopulated them and put Assyrian people, he resettled Assyrians in the northern area. There's some funny stories that come out of that. And but at any rate, Dan was not one of the cities. They apparently resettled. Archaeology suggests that it has been deserted since 733, which just happens to be when Tiglath-Pileser III came down and swept into the northern kingdom. So it was not occupied in Jesus' day. He would not have gone there. Maybe if it was, he might have. But the city was not occupied in Jesus' day, and had not been for several hundred years. So why are we going to Dan today? Well, now let me talk about the pictures you see. Page 2. What you see is 1/4 of these pen and ink drawings of 3 stones that were found as construction stones in a later period gate in Dan, one of the times of Dan's rebuilding. There is virtually no discussion or dissent about the fact that these stones date from about the mid-9th century. That's 800 and something BCE. It's rare that archaeological scholars agree across the board. On this one, they agree. Look at the picture. I have a gorgeous picture of this thing, these 3 stones. And for reasons unknown to me, the software wouldn't drop the picture into this script. All it had was this piece, which is about 1/4 of the way down. Well, let's see. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, about 1/4 of the way down on these stones. And there are 3 stones, you see, 1, 2 that are big, and then a third one that fits down here that's been matched with the text. These stones were carved by the king of Dan. And by the way, understand that in ancient times, these cities were huge, and their rulers were not governors, they were called kings. So there were kings everywhere, some great, some less great, but there were kings everywhere. And the king of Laish, or Dan, goes to war with Hadad, his god, going before him, goes to war with the king of Israel. He says the kings of Israel, and it would be the son of Ahab. That's about the right date. And the kings of the, get ready for this, this is what's important, the house of David. Claims to have killed their sons and many, many others as well by the grace of Hadad. And all that's in this text, what can be read of it. And where does it come from? The ancients liked, you know, when you go in the post office, in the old days when you could afford to have a post office, when you go in the post office, there'll be a bronze plaque somewhere inside the door that says, this building was built by, and it lists all the government people who were involved in building that post office. You remember those days? Well, you never noticed. Anyway, they do. Also, you'll find the same kind of plaques on a bridge sometimes as well. The ancients would chisel steles out, standing stones, usually pyramids like the Washington Monument, and stand them upright and tell the story of their major victories and good things that they did while they were kings so that everybody could read them. That's what this is. Now, how did it get broken up and find its way into a gate post? Well, if we were doing Egypt, we could always talk about the pharaohs there because the pattern's very clear. But when a new king comes, he doesn't want them reading about the other king. He wants them reading about home. So you break it up, and then you put it in a fence post somewhere or a gate post somewhere where it'll never be found again and never be read again. And that's what apparently happened here. This was a stele put up after the victories over the northern kingdom. But why is it so important? we have the stories of David in Samuel, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And all these awesome things David did. And yet, there hasn't been, in all of the archaeological excavations, a single trace, even a hint of the existence of a king named David. So that more academic and sometimes, well, I won't say that. More academic archaeologists have begun to say very publicly and very aggressively, David is a myth. He never existed. Or by now we would have found something of it. In 1993-94, these stones were found, aligned, translated, tested. Nobody questions their authenticity and date. They're the right date. And for the first time we get the phrase, and I killed the sons of the house of David, meaning there has been a progeny of David that's gone now for about 150 years, if the dating of the stones is correct. So there was a David, there was a house of David that followed David, and now suddenly archaeologists are saying, well, if there's this one, there's going to be more. The granddaughter of the Benjamin Mazar, whom I met and who gave me a personal tour of the digs at the south end of the Temple Mount, the ones with the Jesus steps going up. Benjamin Mazar was the archaeologist who dug that dig. And through the Albright, I got an introduction to Mazar and a wonderful day with him. He just took time off and walked me around and explained these things to me. His granddaughter is now a preeminent architect by the name of Elliot Mazar. And she has been digging in the old city of David on the Ophel Hill, that finger that comes down from the Temple Mount and on down into the valley, the Tyropian Valley. And she just claimed about 5 years ago that she believes and she thinks she can prove that she has discovered partial remains of the palace of David. And she thinks she can prove it. So it's been running around a little while, but there's been some serious academic digging on Ophel's Mount, right around Hezekiah's tunnel, right around the Gihon spring, right around that spring that serves the pool inside Jerusalem, pool of Bethsaida, where Jesus healed the blind man. So Dan becomes all of a sudden profoundly significant because we get some Old Testament history that feeds into the train of one named Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is of the lineage and the house of David. We finally got an archaeological, almost uncontested proof of the house of David as a term used in ancient times. Not in our times, not in the Bible, ancient times. This is extra, E-X-T-R-A, extra, outside of the Bible, outside of the faith writings. Third party, enemy of Israel, house of David. You've got virtually all that anybody needs to say, by God, there was a house of David. Now we got to find it. So Dan suddenly becomes excitingly important because what else is there, that will tell us about this time? One other thing that's very clear as well is that before the destruction of the northern kingdom was thought to be apostate. It doesn't have many kings the Bible even gives a slight nod to as good kings. And they were apostate in keeping the true faith of Israel. And so there were throughout the area of the northern kingdom shrines to the Canaanite gods and public sacrifices and ceremonies to the Canaanite gods. And they just lived kind of parallel. And there was trouble in the southern kingdom of Judah as well. And Hezekiah, one of the late kings, who the Bible says is a good king. decides to have a reformation, and he orders that all the shrines and the holy places be destroyed and thrown down. And they did, probably too little, too late. He may have even been moved by the sudden destruction of virtually the entire northern kingdom that was called Israel. And whatever the case, there's this great story about Hezekiah walking on the wall of Jerusalem, looking at Sennacherib's several 100,000 soldiers besieging the city. You starve them out. They can't get out to get water. They can't get out to get food. And so you just sit there. You don't climb the wall. You don't go up to Gslc. You just sit there. And but now I'm getting into maybe 2 weeks from now. So don't let me steal all the good stories for 2 weeks from now. At any rate, he's looking down at this army, and Isaiah says to him, Isaiah is kind of the Secretary of State, and Isaiah says to Hezekiah, you don't have any fear, for they are not going, the Assyrians are not going to conquer Jerusalem, the Babylonians will. Well, Hezekiah says this strange phrase, this is good news, because at least there'll be peace in my time. Rather short-sighted, I'm going to survive, but my grandchildren are in real trouble. But he thinks it's a long time away because at the moment Babylonia is among the world powers a pipsqueak. So until Babylonia gets strong, until Babylonia gets able to kick the backside of the Assyrians, Jerusalem is safe. And so Hezekiah hears this as good news. What happens then is more than 100,000 of Sennacherib's soldiers catch a plague of a disease outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and they die. He no longer has superiority, and he leaves. But he made a stele too, and told all his marvelous things, how he destroyed all the cities of Judah except Jerusalem. But he besieged Jerusalem. And there's a great line in that stele about, but I'm not going to tell you that. That's 2 weeks from now. But what I am saying is that archaeologically speaking, these things turn up, and it takes a while, and sometimes the work of digging rather deeply into the ruins until you find them, and then also having scholars capable of reading cuneiform, of reading ancient Canaanite and Phoenician languages, and that's come later with the aid of the computer as well. We made some guesses, but now we have one of my best friends in seminary, left seminary, went to Johns Hopkins University after he graduated from seminary, and when he graduated, he was able to read and to write 7 Semitic languages, all the way back to cuneiform. But he was the kind of person who could sit with stones like these and tell me what they said. Awesome. That has not been our ability for a real long time. Questions or comments about all the risky things I've said so far? All right. So we have finally from Dan, and Dan therefore is very important to keep digging there. And there are some huge ruins there worth seeing. But it is off the beaten path, right along the base of Mount Hermon, from which the snows come down, and the major snows that come down come gushing, rolling down, and go right by, in fact, right through Dan. So, any questions about Dan? I have a couple friends by that name, but they're not that old. Okay, let me go on, because I've been promising all this time to talk about Bethsaida, the house of the fishermen. Nobody's been able for sure to say where Bethsaida was, or what ruins around the Galilee can be named Bethsaida. Curiously enough, an archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania selected this site that we're going to talk about now in the very, very early 1900s. And he's now deceased, but he got in so much trouble with the Israeli Antiquities Association that he was banned from doing any more digs in Israel. And the reason for that is, like the century before, we too, like the Brits and the Germans, particularly the French a little bit, were just colossal thieves. Everything we found that was interesting, we brought home. Mereneptah's throne room from Egypt, that's the person that follows Ramses. Mereneptah's throne room is set up in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. You can go walk through Mereneptah's throne room. The whole blessed thing is there. Who does it really belong to? It belongs to the people where it originated. But that's not how the thing went. We've talked about Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest full version of Matthew in existence, that's in the British Museum, bought from the Soviet Union when they needed money so badly in the early days of the revolution. It had been brought to Moscow with the request to the monks at Mount St. Catherine's to take it home, where there were translators and others who could study the document and then photograph it, and then they would bring it back. Well, they never did. And when the Soviets took over Russia's government, they sold everything off that had any worth. Didn't matter where it came from. And so the Brits have now what they know was stolen. In Beit Shean, which has long Egyptian history, because it's on the Via Maris, has long Egyptian history there, anthropomorphic coffins. Does anybody know what an anthropomorphic coffin is? Absolutely. The lid is modeled like a human being at sleep. That was an Egyptian custom. There were dozens, isn't enough, scores of anthropomorphic coffins at Beit Shean, and of course the University of Pennsylvania was one of the major excavators of Beit Shean in the early days of the 20th century. And all those coffins are in storage in Philadelphia. That's bad enough. If they had been put on display so that other people could see them, it might be a little better. They've never been put on display. They're there. But if you go to the museum, you will not see the collection of anthropomorphic coffins. So finally, Richardson was banned from excavating in Israel and has long since now died. But he was a major archaeologist, widely respected. But the Germans did it. The French have done it a little bit. The Brits have done it more than us. I said Germany, and of course the United States. Western cultures had enough money to do the digs. Questions, comments? Well, in the house of the fisherman in Bethsaida, there's some real confusion. You know, it's one of the three cities Jesus cursed. And the curse worked so well at Bethsaida, nobody's been able to find it ever since. There are three prime sites for Bethsaida, but for one reason or another, they don't meet the test. This one doesn't either. This meets all the tests because fishermen's paraphernalia is found in this rubble here called the fisherman's house in the bottom of page 3. Right next door to it, by the way, is the winemaker's house, and it's loaded with the kind of paraphernalia that a winemaker would use. It's not like some of the sunken ships that we've excavated and found still drinkable wine underwater. Maybe if you drink it underwater, it would taste good no matter what. I don't know. But there were several things it had to meet. First, it started out to be a place alone. The disciples have just gotten back from their evangelical journey to which Jesus sent them. And to debrief them and also to let them rest, Jesus says, let's go to a place that is out of the way, that is alone. And they went to a place which one of the Gospels says was near Bethsaida. Well, the Bethsaida place alone is on page 4. You can see the Sea of Galilee. We're right at the northern tip. The town of Bethsaida is up this hill 1.2 miles. And these are the grassy, plain places where one could be apart and alone. So this site meets that gospel-given definition. 2, it once described as a, but one gospel even says it was near Bethsaida, but the ruins have been elusive. There are hills in the area as well as the grassy flats. This meets that. It is an out-of-way place, rather so. It is along the Sea of Galilee. Yes, they traveled to it by boat. And so that actually, as you remember also, in the gospel account that tells us that people followed him around the Galilee in the boat, it wasn't very far, but to follow him, you'd have to cross over the Jordan River. And research tells us that it is now a fordable crossover, meaning you can walk across the Jordan at that point. It's shallow. But it was also a crossable point in the first century as well. So this site, sort of better than the others, meets it. And when you find fishing paraphernalia in the village, you can pretty well say this is so. I mentioned already that some archaeologists think some of the ruins on the edge of the Sea of Galilee are actually Zebedee's boathouse. Well, we don't know whether it was Zebedee's boathouse or not, but apparently there was such a structure there. That could explain how a fishing village could be 1.2 miles away and still be a fishing village, because you could do your work at the sea and then walk to your place of residence. But other issues are, this is also on the Jordan River Rift that we've talked about. There's been in this period much volcanic activity, so that the two plates should rub, one riding above the other and lifting this town up higher, which would therefore make the water recede back. And so there's that possibility. And then there's possibly the thing that happens, the entrance of a river into a still body of water tends to build up sediment at the place of entrance that eddies back from the flow. So between sediment building and perhaps tectonic plates moving up and down, you could see this as the city of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is interesting to us because it's probably the original home of Philip, Andrew, and Peter, as well as maybe James and John. If indeed that's Zebedee's boathouse, that would have been the original living place for James and John. We don't have any gospel that says they got an apartment in Capernaum and lived there thereafter, but Peter's mother-in-law is there. So, whatever. We also have the story in Mark about healing the blind man who approaches him in Bethsaida, and Jesus takes him out of the city of Bethsaida and heals him outside the city, and then does something very strange but very frequent in Mark. And that is, he tells him, A, don't go back into the city after you're healed. B, don't tell anybody. Go somewhere else. Mark has Jesus telling people this repeatedly. Don't tell anyone. Even though he's cleansed the leper, he's healed a blind man, he's raised somebody from the dead. The miracle story always ends with, don't tell anyone. Mark is the only one that really does this with any kind of intentionality. The other Gospels, once in a while, do it, but Mark does it consistently. And it's become known by New Testament scholars as the Messianic secret. That is to say, Mark makes Jesus presence a messianic secret. And so he's always saying, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody, don't tell anybody. And I knew one candidate for ministry while I was at St. Luke who wanted to be an associate at St. Luke, preached a sermon on one of those texts, and said nobody knew why Jesus did that, which is a bit off base. The person didn't get the call. We do think we know, and most scholars think they know. But if you don't read the scholars, you won't know. What was the reason? There was a real issue with people seeing Jesus only as the miracle worker. On another occasion, after he's fed 5,000, he says to the crowd, the only reason you're following me is you had free food. He doesn't want what he's doing as he encounters the brokenness of society to be seen as the reason for his ministry. Okay? So he acts with compassion, but he doesn't want the crowd to only be coming looking for favors. I remember my first parish, my first or second church council meeting, one of the councilmen observed that he was a Christian because life goes better if you're a Christian. And I remember my smart mouth of a young seminarian turned pastor. Well, it didn't go that well for Jesus on Good Friday, did it, Mark? So anyway, Jesus was very much concerned, and all the Gospels share that, but they don't share it like, don't tell anybody. In fact, he tells the Gerasenes healed from the demon possession, go back into town and tell everybody what God has done for you. So not all the Gospels have this don't tell anybody, but Mark does. And so there it is there. Now I'm going to stop for questions. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. Yes, Carol?
Can you talk more about the curse that Jesus put on Bethsaida?
I can tell you the story. I can't tell you more about it. What Jesus became aware of was what he feared. People were coming looking for wow stuff, but they weren't really converting. They weren't really repenting. And finally, in his desperation, he said, woe to you, Capernaum, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida. Had the mighty works been done in you that were done here, you would have repented in sackcloth. In other words, he said, I've done all these things. If it had been done in Tyre and Sidon, I'm sorry, I missed the phrase there, they would have repented in sackcloth. So it was a curse because of a lack of lasting, committed response. One of I thought I might say it this afternoon in the sermon, but I think I won't. But one of the things, one of our seminary professors, beloved professor, from Germany, fled Nazi Germany, still spoke in heavy German accent. But Dr. Paulson used to say with a smile on her face, it's not unusual that a seminarian is converted in their second or third parish. And then she would say, regrettably before God, someone never converted. So what Jesus was talking about was that very thing that Dr. Paulson was talking about. You got all the tools, you know all the stories, but you're still the same slob you always were. That's a TAV, that's Ted's authorized version. Yes?
So you refer to the place as Tel, Dan, T-E-L?
Tel, yeah.
And then parentheses, Tel of the judge. What's a Tel? What is it?
A Tel is that mound on the front page.
The mound itself?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's the buildup of previous cities until you get to the top. And it looks like a mountain if it hasn't been dug, except that it's got a flat top. You can drive through the Holy Land today and you say, there was a city, there was a city, there was a city. It hasn't been dug. We don't know what it is, who it is.
It's about great construction.
But it's
When a house got old and decrepit, they just let it collapse and build a new house on top of it. So the city got taller and taller and taller.
You took four things to have a city in the Holy Land. First and foremost, water. Secondly, tillable land. Thirdly, defense. Fourthly, commerce. Alice Chalmers and Caterpillar weren't around yet, so you couldn't take a big blade and reshape the land the way you want it to be. So where there was a hill, there you start. You don't build your town in the valley. That way you're subject to anybody taking you on. You build it with height. That's defense. Each time you build it, it gets higher because, as you say, they use mostly stones. They didn't take the stones back to the quarry. They just smoothed them out and used them for secondary work, just like the secondary use of this stele stone here. And most of the time, a town, they were not easy to build. Therefore, most of the time, you didn't tear them down, but armies did. And the armies would just lay everything waste. And so then you, in essence, some of the stones you might be able to use, but in essence, as you say, you built right on top of them. So it kept going up. And actually, the going up was all right. The higher it went, the more defensive the position was. You with me? Okay. And you see that defense with this tell. And by the way, is it T-E-L-L or T-E-L? They do it both ways. It depends whether it's Arabic or Hebrew or the like. You see the tell here with this is a built-up mound on page 1. Other questions?
Or just a comment. According to a History Channel presentation, the Philistines brought the cultivation of olives to Palestine.
I'm sorry, I missed.
The Philistines brought
Olive trees to Palestine.
Yeah.
Possibly. They've been there a long time. Very good. The point was made that the Philistines were the ones that brought olive trees to that's new information to me, but I accept that. Any other comments? Can I quit? Thank you for enduring so long. Have a good day. You know, we have a service at 5 today, very important service for us. Invite you all to be with us. Good to see you.
How did they build one town on top of another? They didn't have the equipment to, a pile driver or anything to. How did they get?
Paul